Okay, here we are, Kinesiology 230, Chapter 15, Presentation number 6, Guidelines for Assigning Loads and Progression. Let's go ahead and get going. So here we are, we're working through our list. We're just about halfway through Guidelines, page 408. So the goal of a client is always the first priority. That's what you're doing when you start talking about assigning training loads, because that fits into program design, that you're applying a training stimulus that's appropriate for the training response that you want from your client. And you have to understand that even within the context of the goal of a client, you have to have an understanding of their current fitness level. If they are completely deconditioned and they want to run a marathon, you got to understand the disparity between those two and be able to close that gap between them. So when you program rep and set schemes, it's going to be based upon the above two main components of their goals and what their levels of fitness are. And you really are focusing on, like I mentioned in the previous presentation, technique first. Once they have technical proficiency, you can go ahead and increase load, because you know when they start to get fatigued, and fatigue will be a byproduct of increasing load or increasing volume, or just saying fatigue overall. The technique itself, the proficiency of their technique will start to break down, and then you put the person in peril, perhaps risk. So programming itself, and I'll just kind of give a little sidebar here. It is literally on the front end about teaching proper movement patterns first, and teaching people how to have more refined movement patterns to be able to push their weights more effectively, or another way to say it is more efficiently. So you can look at it in terms of your first couple of sessions, in terms of how you can have different types of equipment. It can be like cousins to one another. Okay, if we do a seated chest press over here, well, this line of equipment is free motion. If we go over here to this line of equipment, this is matrix. This is a seated chest press. Notice how they're similar, but notice how they're different. You can do one on a Monday, one on a Wednesday. If you want to do push-ups, that would be in the same family tree. That's a conversation I've had 100 times. Whether it's dumbbells, barbell, free motion, dumbbells, barbells, push-ups, whatever it may be. I've talked about the different modalities of exercise, and I do that deliberately so my clients can work out on their own. You got to also understand that smaller stabilization muscles get stronger, and it's part of the process. So that shake and bake that you see when a person's holding onto a handle or a dumbbell, part of that is just their body reconciling how to utilize that piece of equipment and stabilize, and also be strong enough to hold onto a dumbbell and not have it collapse on the person. They can hold onto a handle on a piece of equipment. You'll see them kind of shake around a little bit. Those are the small stabilization muscles across the wrist, across the elbow, across the shoulder. Now, no doubt you're going to have some shake and bake when a person starts to fatigue, and you're going to have some gross motor movement, shake and bake. But generally what you see is when you put load into the system, the little stabilizers have to do some work that they're not accustomed to. And so as a result, you'll see that the movement pattern will actually become more refined as they start to work out more. Okay, so they use this as a way to adjust trial load when you're working with a client. And I will tell you that there's a little bit of skewness to this. Let me just get myself kind of tucked out of the way here. And the reason why I say that is, if you're teaching your client how to do a gross motor movement versus a fine motor movement, or a multi-joint movement versus a single joint movement, then the increment of perhaps 5 pounds might not be proper, right? It might be a case in terms of a single joint exercise where maybe it's more on the order of a percentage that you use in your head. It might be 5%, 10%, 15%, as opposed to 5 pounds, 10 pounds. But what they're saying is this: you hand the client some handles, they're doing a seated chest press on a piece of equipment, and they get into the equipment, and you want them to do 14 to 15 repetitions, and they end up doing 18. Well, you could probably increase the resistance by 10 pounds. If, for example, you want them to do somewhere between 10 and 11 repetitions, and they do 18 reps, you want to increase that by 15 pounds. Conversely, same thing down here. You want them to do 4 to 5, and they do, I do 18 repetitions, you got to increase by 30 pounds. So what they're saying on this is, if you have a client and you're trying to work them within a particular rep range, here it's 8 to 10, that's why it's blank, 8 to 10. If they land on 8 to 10, perfect, change nothing. If they only get 4 to 5 reps, then you're going to back off 15 pounds. If they end up doing 16 to 17 reps, then you're going to add 15 pounds. That's what they're saying here in table 515. I would take a couple moments just to kind of acquaint yourself with this concept, but don't freak too much about, the actual numbers in here, but you got to understand that that's kind of conceptually one of the things I believe they ask about in the test. Training load and repetition schemes for targeted goals. So if we look at the topic of repetitions and sets, a person who is trying to work on muscular endurance, who's a novice, you're going to have 10 to 15 repetitions, and a novice is going to do 1 to 3 sets. A person who's more advanced will do 15 to 30 repetitions. So already the volume per set is higher there. And you're looking at perhaps 3 or 4 sets. So you have two things at play here, one of which is the volume you're completing or doing with each set is higher, and then you're doing more sets in theory, so your total volume will be higher. And then presumably because they're more advanced, they're probably pushing around more weight, so their total volume load would also be higher. And it's the same thing over here. If you're looking for muscular power, notice how they say for novice, not so much because you have to build into it. For an intermediate, you're doing 3 to 6 repetitions, advanced 1 to 6 repetitions, and here you get 1 to 3 sets to 3 to 6 sets. So just think of this in terms of the total volume and total volume load that would be experienced for these types of exercises. What happens is because power incorporates a component of time, there's higher force, there's higher power components that are involved in the equation, and there's more loading that happens on the body in a shorter amount of time. So it affects the body a little bit differently. That's why you have that lower rep range when we talk muscular power. But I will also point out that when you start talking muscular power, there's a bit of an exponential component because you have power is work divided by time. And that's another conversation for another class, but just realize how the rep scheme changes as you go from endurance to hypertrophy to strength to power, and how they even talk about here. And you'll see people do, in some classes, they'll do 20 rep sets on power clean, and you're like, that's not a power clean, that's an endurance clean, right? It's nonsensical to say a power clean, you're doing 20 reps. I digress. Okay. Progression is the process where the client continues to move forward towards a predetermined goal. Maintenance is where a client has reached their goal and is attempting to maintain a specific level of fitness. Kind of makes sense if you just think of in terms of what they're writing out there, the answers in the name itself. The book describes a 2 for 2 rule. If you get 2 more reps than the goal for 2 workouts, which go back to our total volume load example, when somebody's doing sets of 12 and you ask them to do sets of 10, they've done 36 reps versus 30 reps. The total volume load goes from 3,000 pounds to 3,600 pounds if you think of that previous presentation. But in a 2 for 2 rule, if you do 2 more reps than the goal for 2 workouts, then you're going to increase the resistance, which is fine. But I will tell you, it's going to be definitely curvilinear when you're working with your clients. You're going to see them take off pretty early on. When you look at progression regression, and I use this quite regularly, if you're increasing the repetitions or increasing the amount of resistance, that's a progression. If you're decreasing the repetitions or decreasing the resistance, that would be a regression. But as you start to incorporate in different skills and challenges, perhaps you're asking them to do a dumbbell bench press while laying on a physio ball or standing on a BOSU, they're doing a bicep curl, it could be any number of different things. What you're doing is you're progressing in one area, the instability area, but you would probably need to regress the weight or the repetitions because you've introduced in the unstable environment. So as I progressed in one area, I might need to regress in the other. And it's just an inherent relationship that you have when you start incorporating in and have mixed modalities of training. So I'm jumping from this. I'm going to go to the next one. The next one is kind of like an aside. It's one of the ones that I wrote. It's a little bit tied to the book, but it's also tied to some of my experience. So I'm eager to get into that. So I'm going to break off from here and move on to the next one.